Welcome back to the third and unfortunately final meeting of our wonderful class, What Stops the Plague, with Ms. Miriam Gedwiser. Before we get into our last class this evening, I would like to make people aware of the fact that Drisha will be having some special classes, pre-holiday classes, tomorrow night and Wednesday night and Thursday night. So 3 nights in a row, same time as this class, same place, kind of. You'll get a different link to log in, but each will be focusing on piyutim. So I think each has its own piyut that you can look into. The liturgical poems of the holidays, and people will get really in depth, and I'm sure it'll be wonderful because I've never experienced a Drisha class that wasn't wonderful. But to help people get into the holiday spirit, because we need to do what we can. But that's my announcement for now. I'm sure I'll have more announcements at the end of class, but I will hand it over to Miss Gedwiser, who's far more interesting than I am.
Today, thanks for joining. Thanks for sticking with us. Today, I wanted to go backwards a little bit in Sefer Bamidbar. Last time I went to, we looked at some passages from Parshat Pinchas. Today, I want to go backwards a little bit. I felt like, well, I'm going to say that it wasn't just a historical accident that I put them in this order, because I think some of the themes from today will maybe like tie together both of the previous sessions, and also it's a little bit of a maybe more uplifting note than like the Pinchas zealotry, killing people, stopping the plague. We'll see. Okay, so I called it Bein HaChayim Bein HaMetim, as we'll see where that comes from. This is actually a very long passage. And the real thing to do here is to, that's interesting, is to move backwards in, sorry, I'm gonna do a little bit of a little dance. To refresh our recollection, let's say, about the story of Korach, which is where we're gonna pick up, numbers 16 and 17 can be a little challenging to follow. Not totally our topic, but I just, in order to understand this part of the story, we need to understand a little bit about what happens before. So here we're going back to the beginning of number 16. So here we are. Vayikach Korach, right? And I'm not going to read the whole thing out loud. It's going to take a while. I'm just going to sort of go a little bit. So Korach took, great question. What did he take? Rashi talks about it the last time. We also saw Vayikach Pinchas, right? He took something. Vayikach seems to be like, it's sort of like, that's sort of how I read it. I don't know if that's what it is. So Korach and Korach, who's a Levite, and Datan and Aviram, who are and On ben Pelet, who are Reuvenites, come, and they come to Moshe, and they, with 250 leaders of the Jewish people, again, the leaders who last time were basically content to not do anything. Well, not these leaders, because these ones are already going to be dead by later on into Sefer Bamidbar, as we'll see, but okay. So these 250 leaders who last time were content to do basically nothing about problems, but now are kind of really upset that they don't have so much power. So they come to Moshe and they say, Rav Lachem, you have too much, you've gone too far. Everybody is holy. What makes you so special? Why do you raise yourselves above the Lord, above the Lord's congregation? So what ensues is sort of a variety of attempts, sort of maybe trial by ordeal, to prove why Moshe and Aaron, or maybe just Aaron, in fact deserve their elevated position. And I think that's maybe an interesting way to keep in mind. Okay, so Moshe's initial reaction is he falls on his face, right? He doesn't seem to know what to do or how to do it. And then he says to Korach, okay, you know what? Tomorrow we'll have a showdown. Everybody, whichever one Hashem likes, God will bring close to him. Hashem et asher lo et hakadosh v'hikriv elav. I don't know if this sounds any. So there is another story that I think this whole passage is in dialogue with. I don't know if anyone has any thoughts as to what it might be, or we need to go a little further to see. Okay. So I'm just going to say that there is another story, I think, that is in the background here, but okay. So he says, Hashem will show who is his holy one and who he brings close to him, kadosh and karov, okay? Zotasu, so everybody take fire pans, right? And put fire in them and put incense on them. And tomorrow, God will choose who God wants. What does it seem like the plan is, right? Like, what does this mean? How is God going to indicate who God chooses? Not enough talkers today, so I guess I'll answer my own questions, but you can always jump in. Right? So it's possible that it means, like, God is going to choose which one to zap, basically, right? In a good way, right? God is going to be like, I choose you. I'm going to eat this, but or I don't know exactly what's going to happen, right? But it seems, right, like we have other places, which is going to be mentioned in one of our Farshim later, right? We have other places where groups of people are sort of vying for which ones are the real servants of God. And it seems like you can sort of present an offering and expect God to choose in some way. Right, so Moshe says, right, after he proposes this plan, he sort of has words with Bnei Korach, and then he says, like, why are you even bothering me? It's God who chose me. And then there's this whole exchange with the Tatan and Aviram, right? Moshe prays to God, please don't look towards their offering. Everybody take your stuff, right? Like I said, the text is a little bit hard to parse, but that's okay, right? Everybody take your fire pan. There's 250 of them, and Aaron is also bringing his. Everybody, they do it, right? By simulim ketor ve'amudu petach ol moed Moshe ve'Aaron ve'akel ehem Korach et kol ha'ida. Korach brings everybody to watch, right? Because he thinks he's going to be vindicated. It seems. Vayira kivod Hashem al kol ha'ida. So this is our second clue, hint, connection to the other story. Did you just have a moment of recognition, Mother? Right, so we had people who God is going to bring close to him because they're holy, karov and kadosh, and we have God's kavod is going to be visible or made visible. The presence of the Lord will appear to the whole community.
Well, there's the story of Eliyahu at Har Carmel, but that's actually many, many centuries later. So in a
right,
sense,
so maybe that refers to this.
Right.
Right, so Eliyahu and Har Carmel is the story I was thinking of, which will be mentioned in one of the Mefarshim, right? Where you have like a showdown between two groups who are vying for being the one true representative, or a group and an individual, right? What about a story from Sefer Vayikra? Right, God's presence is made visible. God is going to choose those who are holy to bring close.
This is maybe a little off the beaten path, but maybe when Miriam and Aaron are talking about Moshe, and then Hashem appears and says, actually, I like Moshe better than you guys.
Okay, so let me think about that. Right. Maybe, I'm not sure if it uses the word kadosh there, right? Or karov, right? God is, there's like this metaphor, Moshe is like a b'chol beiti ne'emanhu. My mother has correctly noted in the chat, this is Nadav and Avihu, right? Nadav and Avihu are going to happen on the day, or it's not Nadav and Avihu, but it has Nadav and Avihu resonances. I don't know fully what to make of that parallel, actually, but it's definitely there, I think, right? Nadav and Avihu, remember, are Aaron's two sons who in Sefer Vayikra a few weeks ago, right before Pesach, right after Pesach, actually, right? Who on the day, right, that got sort of the Mishkan is supposed to be dedicated, and Moshe promises, right, if you follow these steps, right, God's glory will be revealed to you. They follow the steps. God's glory is in fact revealed to the people, whatever that means. And then, inspired by what people can talk about at for like a long time, right? Nadav and Avihu bring their own fire, right? Right? It's this sort of strange fire that God did not command. They go into the Mishkan or the Kodesh Kodeshim and they get zapped, right? Right, and Moshe says, "Hu asher diber Hashem bikrovai akadesh." This is what God has said. With those who are close to me, I will be sanctified. Right. So you have this idea of Yirak Vod Hashem, right? That like the glory of God is being revealed, and there it's sort of like the destruction of the pretenders, the people who overstepped, is part of the sanctification through those who are holy, right? And it seems like maybe something similar is going to happen here, right? And in some ways, right? And last week, one of our guess, right? Zev mentioned this, that like, right, how is Pinchas that different from those people? Right? How is Pinchas that different from Nadav and Abihu, who did this thing that is not really in the books? And maybe the answer is the motive, and we'll see today, right? Here we're getting, and also the fact that Pinchas at the time was not a Kohen. So here we're getting much closer to Nadav and Abihu territory, because we're bringing Ketoret specifically, which is the thing that they brought. We're bringing it at a time and place that is not encapsulated in ordinary rituals, to say the least, right? This is not like the ordinary time. Usually that's like a more of a Yom Kippur thing, right? So, and it's sort of, it's not even happening in the Mishkan, as we're going to see later. So, right, there's a lot of Nadav and Avihu residences, and it seems, right, one might be forgiven for asking whether even Aharon is really supposed to do something like this. So we'll see a little bit of that later, right? So everybody comes, Hashem says to Moshe, right, get away from those people, because I'm going to nod at them. They get swallowed up. And so that seems to be Datan Vaviram, what happens to them. And then he said, and then at the very end, it will say, right, sorry. At the very end of this parak, it seems like maybe Korach himself gets swallowed up by the ground, but the people who bring the Ketoret get sort of a fire goes out from before God, which is similar to the wording in Nadav and Abihu, right? And they get consumed, which seems like it's almost like a sort of it's like a natural consequence of bringing an unasked for Ketoret offering. Okay. So that's our background. Ketoret is going to play a central role in what happens next as well. So first, Hashem says to Moshe, and right? First of all, order Aaron to remove the fire pans, which is similar to the aftermath of Nadav and Abihu, also actually because Moshe says to Aaron, okay, he says, sorry, to two of the other priests, go remove the bodies of your brothers who have been destroyed. But so you have to remove something, and and you should do something with them. They've been sanctified, so you should sort of spill out their contents, and you should make them into a hammered plating for the altar, which there's a lot to say about as well. And this is a reminder to everybody not to do that, right? Now here's where I really want to pick up. 10 minutes later, right? The next day, right? So this big dramatic thing happens, and it seems like, right, that story is in some ways closed, right? Like God made God's choice, right? And everybody should be satisfied to some degree, right? And we may not only is our sort of problem done, but we've sort of we've already created the monument, right? We already put the stuff on the mizbeach, and we're like, okay, well, that's settled now. But the next morning, people are not as excited, as sort of sanguine about it as they may have been the day before. Right? So everybody complained to Moshe, Hamitem et am Hashem. You have killed the people of God. Who are they referring to? So remember, the people, we sort of glossed a little bit over it, but the people who've been killed are Korach, Datan, and Abiram, kind of the ringleaders, and these 250 leaders and their families, by the way, at least the families of Korach, Datan, and Abiram, it seems. Who are Bnei Israel sort of sympathetic to or upset about? Or I guess rather, right, is this like a case of them sort of similar to what we saw in the Midrash about Pinchas, about, right, the people kind of being upset even after it becomes clear that God is sort of smiting them for doing this and saying, who are you, Pinchas? Or is this a case where maybe they're upset because of the large loss of, as we're going to see in some of Farshim, they're upset because of the Am Hashem they're talking about as these 250 leaders, but not necessarily Korach. So we'll see. Right? So everybody is sort of ganging up on Moshe and Aaron. Last time this happened, they fell on their faces and cried. This time they turned to the Oham Moed, because they're kind of like, well, God saved us yesterday. Maybe God will come through again today, maybe. I don't know. And they see that God's presence is again apparent. So Moshe and Aaron come to the tent of meeting. V'deber Hashem Moshe lemor, hiromu mitoch ha'edah hazot, v'achalei otam keraga. And God says, right, seemingly in the tent of meeting, right, remove yourselves from this community that I may annihilate them in an instant. They pull up Nehum again, right? They fall on their face. They do not remove themselves from the community, right? Similar to how last week God said, right, like execute all the leaders, or that's one interpretation, and they don't do that. Moshe does something that tries to be a little bit less sort of wide ranging. So he falls on his face, and Moshe says to Aharon, right, take your fire pan again, put fire on it from the mizbeach, and put incense on it, and go quickly to the people, the chaper alehem, and perform atonement, ki yatsa haketzef milifnei Hashem hechel hanegef, right? Because anger has already come out from God, the plague has begun, which again, right, like actually very similar to last week, right? Like you don't know there's a plague until somebody is trying to stop it. Right, so some sort of a plague has begun. It's interesting he calls it ha-negef, right? Like as if, well, obviously there's going to be a plague. This is exactly the kind of thing that generates plagues, right? Whatever has happened here. It was only a matter of time, and now it's here. And here's what you should do, Aaron. Go take your ketoret and your fire pan and fix it, right? He takes what Moshe told him, and he runs into the middle of the people, which is going to be, I think, an important image, right? In fact, it is true, as Moshe has told him, right, that the plague has begun. Right. So he does the incense and he makes expiation for the people. He atones for them. And he stands between the living and the dead. And so Aaron is sort of like this liminal figure. I'm gonna have a movie reference later for this. Right. And he stops the plague. It seems like whatever Aaron has done is the thing that stops the plague, this kapara, but it's kapara that's not achieved by killing people. It's achieved by doing incense, right? Vayom team, and the number is very large, right? 14,700. And Aaron and Moshe go back to the temple, to the tent. Okay, so that's our passage, right? The passage that actually involves the plague is pretty short, but we had to see it, and actually it continues on a little bit, but not for us. So right, we have to see it a little bit in context because, right, Aaron and Moshe, first they have this trial against the Korach people, right, in which God they all bring incense and God prefers Aharon, and the result for the other people is that they get zapped, right? Then Aharon sort of uses this same tool not to zap people, but to save them from the plague. So I'm not sure I fully have a handle on the symbolism of Ketoret itself, but it seems like that's probably something here. But I want to sort of dive in a little bit. So as is my custom, I'm going to start with an interesting Gemara that expands on this story. Okay, so I'm Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi. There's a few. So this is from Shabbat 88b. It's an extended passage in Masechet Shabbat that has a bunch of a dot of Matan Torah. Right, so stories about what happened at Matan Torah. That's one sort of way to locate this midrash in context. Another way is just to note this midrash is going to start. It's a story about when Moshe went up to heaven. There's a whole bunch of midrashim that start that way, and it would be interesting to compare them. It's one of my writing projects that may or may not ever happen. Maybe it's already happened by someone else. Actually, I haven't checked. So, right. So when Moshe went up to heaven. So the angels said to God, right? And there's many versions of this that appear all over rabbinic literature. Here's this one from Shabbat, right? What is this man of women born doing among us, right? This is, I thought, right? This is angels only, right? No humans allowed. Amar lahan lekabel Torah. They said, God said, oh, that's easy. He's coming to get the Torah. Right? You have this super secret treasure that you've been holding for 974 generations before the creation of the world, and you're trying to give it to flesh and blood, right? And then the Torah exists for 1,000 generations from, but whatever generations means before the existence of the world. I think it's right. It's 26 generations from Adam to Moshe. That should be true. So that's sort of why that number comes from, I believe. Right, so they're basically no, the Torah is great up here. It was here before people were around. It belongs up here. The Torah is a heavenly document. It has this sort of mystical, ethereal significance. So how can at time of vacation now you're going to give it to flesh and blood? People are basically made out of meat. Okay. Is a quote from Psalms, right? What's the point of human beings? Why should you even care about them, right? It's sort of taking that out of context where it's said by the psalmist to say a human feeling of humility, and now it's the angels kind of putting humans down. Okay. Hashem adneinu ma shemcha b'chol haaretz, right? You know, and another proof text, as it were, right? God, your name is glorious in all the earth. How glorious is your name? Asher tenahodcha al hashemayim. When you place your majesty in heaven, right? That the majesty, meaning the Torah, should stay in heaven. What are you doing trying to give it to people? Moshe said, God said to Moshe, hey, give them an answer, right? Now the angels were not interested in Moshe, partly because they think Moshe is not worthy of this whole situation, right? So they didn't ask him, but God was like, oh, why don't you ask Moshe, right? And in some ways, that already is giving Moshe more respect than the angels did, right? It's sort of including him in the conversation about himself. Sorry, let me remove an ant from my keyboard. Sorry. Just makes me anxious to see it little crawling around there. Not that I have anything against our insect friends. So God has already brought Moshe into the conversation in a way that he hadn't with the previous, that the angels were sort of wanted to talk about him, and God's like, well, let's talk to him, right? So he says, Moshe, give them a response. I'm actually a little afraid, right? Maybe their breath is even going to burn me, which is sort of an interesting idea, right? And it feels similar to our text, where if you get too, and to the Nadav and Avihu story, right? If you get too close to divine things, right, either God or the temple or the angels, you can get burned as a human, right? That our bodies can't withstand a certain level of spiritual connection. Amarlo achos b'chisei chivodi v'chazor lahem tshuva. So God said, okay, don't worry, I'll protect you, right? Hold on to my throne. It's like home base, right? And then you can answer them and they can't burn you, which is also kind of interesting because maybe in its sort of best form, that's a function that the Olam Moed or the Mishkan can perform as well, which is it gives people the ability as sort of or the Mishkan, I think especially, right? It's constructed to allow people to achieve a level of sanctity that they can't under ordinary circumstances by sort of grabbing onto the path that God has given them. Okay. And then there's a proof text for that as well. Melchez Pnei Kisei. Okay. Amar Rabbi, and then actually Parshes Alav Anano, right? Or Parash Alav. That shouldn't be, the Zion shouldn't be there probably. The Zion is probably just the footnote column, my mistake. Apologies. So, right. The one who saw the face of he causes him to grasp the front of the throne and spreads his cloud over it, right? So the thing that protects you is the cloud, which is interesting only because incense makes a cloud, right? Incense is a cloud as opposed to fire. Okay. Torah, right? The Maravi says, sorry. So he says to God, before God, well, what does it say in the Torah, right? Moshe hasn't even gotten the Torah yet. So how's he supposed to answer why he deserves to get it? So he says, hey, what's in the Torah? It seems like maybe he actually does kind of know, and that's why he can ask this question, because he's a good lawyer and he doesn't ask a question he doesn't know the answer to. So I don't know exactly how to read it that way, right? Maybe he knows the answer to the question and that's why he's able to say this, right? So he says, what does it say in your Torah? Then he looks to the angels. He says, the Mitzrayim, were you in Egypt? God says, I'm your God who took you out of Egypt, but were you in Egypt? I missed that part, right? What do you need the Torah for? Then he says, okay, what else is in there? Then it says, you shouldn't have any other gods. And then he says to the angels, well, are you hanging out with people who worship other gods? Because why would you even think of that? You're up here, right? This is clearly not directed at you. What else is in there, right? Zachor Yom Shabbat L'Kadasho, right? Oh, it also says remember the Sabbath day. And he says, well, do you guys have jobs that you need to stop doing every seventh day? What is this even? And then he says, Lo Tisa, right? Don't take the name of the Lord your God in vain. And then he's like, well, do you even have Masal Matan? Do you have things that you would be wanting to take oaths over? Right? He goes through all these mitzvot, right? Do you have fathers and mothers that you would need to honor? Do you have people that is murdering a thing up here, right? Can you commit adultery? Can you steal from each other? Do you even have these negative emotions that cause all these behaviors? Miyad hodulo lakadosh baruch hu. So immediately they and this is sort of a nice touch, I think. So remember, right, the angels challenge God. God says, oh, Moshe, give them an answer. And the angels, hodu lo, it sounds like they concede to him, but they're not conceding to Moshe. They're not actually willing to give Moshe the honor of being like, oh yeah, okay, Moshe, you're right. They say to God, right, they concede to God, Shnemar Hashem, right, Ma Dir Shemcha v'chol haaretz. Right, they say, God our Lord, how glorious is your name in all the heaven and earth. Well, your majesty, right, it doesn't say Asher Tanah Chal Hashemayim. Right, okay. So immediately, right, they did ignore Moshe, but they are going to give him something. Kol echad ve'echad nasala ohev. Everybody becomes Moshe's best friend, and they gave him something special, as it says, Alita l'marom shavita shevi lakachta matanot ba'adam. Right, you went up high, you took captive, and you took gifts on account of man. The captive may actually be the Torah, and he takes gifts. The meaning of the verse is in a reward for the fact that they called you man, not an angel, as the sort of the side the English is explaining. They gave him presents, and this is for us, right? This whole story. Why have we been reading the story? It's a great story, but why are we here for this line? Af malach hamavet masar lo davar. Even the angel of death gave him something, right? He gets a special secret gift from the angel of death, and here's what it is. Shene Amar, as it says in a verse, Vayitain et haketoret vechaper al ha'am, right? He, this is from our story, right? When Aaron puts the incense onto his pan, it creates atonement for the people, and the dying stops. Right? And he was able to stand between the dead and the living, right? And then the plague stopped, right? How could Aaron possibly have known that this would work to stop death, if not for the fact that it was a secret passed on by the angel of death when Moshe went up to heaven? Okay, so that's sort of one view, is that this is like a totally esoteric, weird thing to happen, and that it's because, right, because Moshe was sort of able to prove that the Torah. So let's actually think it through for a second, right? What was Moshe able to do, right? Why did Moshe get this present from the angel of death? Because he was able to prove that the Torah is written for fallible human beings rather than for angels, right? So like that feature of the Torah is the thing that that then allows Moshe to sort of get this super secret thing, which is kind of interesting, because part of what atonement maybe is for like handling our flaws, right? As opposed to just kind of like, you're wrong, get zapped. Okay. So whatever Aaron does, it could be that it was passed on as a super secret something from the angel of death himself. And that Aaron, we're going to see later a different version of an encounter with the angel of death in this passage. But so here it seems like it was given over, at least initially, consensually. Okay. So there's another Gemara in Zvachim, which goes like this. It's talking about different exactly what atones for what, which is sort of a funny way of saying it, but there have previously been sort of atonement for certain things has been attributed to certain things that the Kohen does or wears. So now we're going to say, is it really so that the priestly vestments atone for these sins, which was the previous position? Here's our Breita, or not really Breita, Meira, Amar Yeshua ben Levi, Shnei dvarim lo matzino lehem kapara b'korbanot. Right, two things do not have any kapara, atonement, among the sacrifices. Let's translate it as not offerings, maybe, right? Umatzino lo kapara b'makom acher, but they do have atonement from some non-sacrificial thing, which are shvichut damim v'lashon hara. Okay, murder and lashon hara. Now, so for those who are perky-eared, we did meet lashon hara in our first session as perhaps the cause of Askara, this like terrible plague of which the students of Rabbi Akiva died. Okay, so shvichut damim. So if these things are not atoned for by sacrifices, what are they atoned for by? Right, shvichut damim me'egla arufa. Right, bloodshed is atoned by the heifer whose the egla arufa is this ritual where if you find a body and you don't know who killed it, the elders from the closest city are supposed to go and perform this whole. So they kill the calf and they say this whole thing, basically like our hands have not spilled this blood. It's like an expiation ritual for when a death is sort of otherwise unexplained, and therefore maybe can't be dealt with through like a normal criminal system, for example. Okay, so. Egla arufa, the lashon hara make a Torah, right? And lashon hara is not atoned for by any sacrifices, right? Ordinarily, if you commit a sin, there's a sacrifice for that. There's a chatat or an asham, right? And we'll talk a little bit about the mechanics of those in a minute. I hope later, right? So lashon hara is atoned for not by any regular sacrifice, but by the ketoret. Now it's interesting. It seems like ketoret is not a korban, right? It's not a thing that you offer to God that then the Kohanim or the Mizbeach consumes, right? It's something different, right? It's a way of approaching God maybe, but it's not really a korban. So that's just like an interesting thing to think about, right? That like when you bring ketoret, it's not an offering in the same way, at least in the way this Gemara presents it, right? So when, for example, Moshe suggests bringing ketoret, he's getting straight to directly to the like, are you a person who can approach God or not? Everybody could bring korbanot, as we're going to see later, right? But like, are you a person who can sort of like, this is like the key to the castle. Does it work for you or does it shrink in your hand, right? Or whatever. I don't know. I feel like there's sort of like a fairy tale aspect here. Okay. So how do we know that ketoret is mechaper, right? How do we know that ketoret works for this purpose? From our pasuk, right? That when Aaron put ketoret out there, it caused kapara, which is sort of interesting, right? Because what sin is ketoret supposed to be atoning for in this Gemara? Like lashon hara. And like, it's sort of interesting to import that back into our passage from Numbers. Like, well, is this case, is the situation with Korach or with the people who are sort of upset that Moshe has had Korach killed, is that really like a lashon hara kind of situation? I don't know, but I do think it definitely does, to me at least, have resonances with our Rabbi Akiva situation as well, which is, right, we have these Gemaras connecting Askara to lashon hara, and we have other places that talk about Rabbi Akiva's students like not treating each other with respect. But that like lashon hara in some ways is a stand-in for some kind of societal breakdown, or sort of like a breakdown of collective action and collective sort of respect in a society, right? And so like it does seem like that's what's happening with Korach. Similar to last week, right? Like there's sort of a breakdown of order in the sense of not like leadership per se. The leadership doesn't respond, but last time it's sort of like idolatry and sexual sins, but this time it's right there is some sort of a breakdown, and lashon hara is sort of like the exemplar of that, which is an interesting thing for those of us who sometimes speak lashon hara to be careful about, right? The Tani Devei Rabbi Shmuel, right? And further, we have a statement in the name of Rabbi School of Rabbi Shmuel, right? Ma ketoret mechaperet lashon hara, right? Right. So he said remember, our Gemara started with this with like what exactly atones for what, but along the way we're going to learn some interesting things. Like, for example, why should ketoret atone for lashon hara? Because according to this statement of the house of Rabbi Shmuel, yavo davar shebechashai v'chaper al maaseh chashai, right? Something that is secretive should come and give atonement for something else that is secretive, which is sort of an interesting way of thinking about lashon hara and ketoret, right? What's secretive about ketoret? If anything. Like it's not totally, I mean, so one possibility I think is that it's brought in the Kodesh Kodeshim, right? You bring it into the sort of secret holy of holies in the Mishkan or the Mikdash. Another possibility is that the whole nature of Ketoret is that it creates a cloud, right? It sort of always creates privacy. Maybe that's how you use it to encounter God, right? Sort of by embracing the mystery and lack of knowledge, let's say. So, right, whereas lashon hara is sort of a negative use of privacy and concealment in order to sow discord. Okay, right. So now the Gemara is going to do its thing, right? Like, oh, well, before we said that these two things were atoned for by different things, right? It's true. There's also an incense altar. That's true, but it's still not in the outside courtyard, right? It's one level in from the altar, from the big mizbeach, right? I believe this is one like not having paid attention to Vayikra enough comes back to bite you. But okay. So right, so the Gemara has to like resolve its things and it says, wait a minute, didn't we say that right at the end, what about the contradiction between whether Ketoret is sort of whether lashon hara is atoned for by the Ketoret or by the Me'il of the Kohen? Well, it depends on whether you said lashon hara in public or in private. Private lashon hara is atoned for by the Ketoret. Great. Okay. So, yes, no, I don't know. What do we have so far? We have this story. We have the object that by which people who sort of wielded it illegitimately were stricken down, meaning the ketoret, is the object by which Aaron can save them. We have one Gemara suggesting that that's because it's sort of this secret from the angel of death that was given to Moshe once Moshe proved that the Torah is really intended for fallible people, right, as opposed to for infallible angels. Then we have another Gemara that sort of suggests that Ketoret, right, is there to atone for Lashon Hara, this divisive form of sin. And already I think those two can kind of fit together. Okay. I'm going to move on to a third midrash. This midrash is a late midrash. The second thing in here in slightly abbreviated form appears in Rashi, and it's one of these situations where you can't tell whether Rashi got it from here or this took it from Rashi, because this is a medieval French compilation. Okay, it may appear elsewhere. Actually, also don't quote me on that, but okay. So there's two passages here. Okay. When Aaron put the ketoret on the pan, Aaron, what did he do? And he put it in front of the angel of death. Right? He put it before the angel of death. It says they shall offer your incense to savor. Does anyone know where that pasuk is from? I mean, you can see it. It's from Devarim, the end of Devarim. Anyone know the context? Right. So first of all, right, this seems to, I guess I'll take a step back in a second. Like, other than the fact that like it's influenced by a Gemara, why is the Gemara even going there? Right, this whole genre of sort of like Aaron confronting the angel of death here, I think makes sense in the context of, right, like God has started to smite the people for doing something wrong. And unlike Pinchas, right, Pinchas, as we saw last week, is trying to symbolically correct the people, right, by sort of like, doing a symbol, sort of an exemplary killing or something like that. But Aaron is not trying to correct the people, right? Aaron is trying to correct God. And I think that's right, to stop the negative without changing anything on the ground, other than just like go away. And that's where this whole idea of a confrontation with the angel of death, or using the angel of death's own tools against him, or something like that, is coming from, I think. So here, first of all, it says, right, this quotation, I think, is very interesting. These two midrashim are a companion in that they both use quotations from the same passage. So let's see that passage here. This is from the brachot of Moshe at the end of Sefer Dvarim. He gives a bracha to each tribe, and here is the bracha for Levi, which is the tribe of which Aaron is a member. Levi Amar, Tumecha v'urecha leish chasidecha, right? Your Tumim and Urim are for your faithful one, right? Asher nisitova Masa derivei al Meribah, who tested at Masa and challenged at the waters of Meribah. That's probably Moshe, or maybe Aaron, right? Like, right, basically, like, you're a faithful leader even though the people are always messing up, right? Maybe. People who said to their parents, their father and mother, I don't care about you. They didn't recognize his brothers or his sons. Right? Like, they just observe your precepts alone and keep your covenant. This is often interpreted as referring to, right, the episode of the golden calf, where the tribe of Levi went around killing people, no matter who they were. Okay, so, right, like, that's sort of like a Pinchas type moment, right? Killing people after the golden calf. But now we have this alternative, right? Right? They shall teach your, meaning God's, laws to Jacob, Israel, your instructions to Israel, like a parallel structure. Yasimu Kitarab. So they're going to be the teachers, which is the image in a lot of Sefer Dvarim and elsewhere, right? That the sort of rabbinic, what we would think of as the rabbinic class, is really the priestly class, right? They're the sort of legal authorities, right? Right, so they're going to teach your laws, and they will offer you incense and offerings on your altar. So, right, in original context, who is the ketoret being offered to here by the Bnei Levi? Yeah, to God, right? That's like part of their job, right? They teach the laws, they bring the ketoret, they bring the other offerings, right? So our midrash says, oh, no. Actually, Yasimu Ketorah ba'apecha, right? It might be that it's in sort of there's something about the word off that makes them want to interpret it as sort of like God's nemesis. I'm not sure, right? Or maybe that the angel represents God's anger or something like that. But that's sort of interesting. And I just want to finish the last pasuk here. Right? Bless, O Lord, his substance. Chelo, right? Like chayil could also, right? His substance is sort of like his like strength or ability, right? Favor his undertakings, smite the loins of his foe, and let his enemies rise no more. Which could be taken either literally or metaphorically, depending on how you want to. Okay, so our passage, the first thing it does is say, right, we said that, like, you know, Levi and his descendants, or we're going to say later in the Torah, right, Levi and his descendants sort of get the special power of Ketoret. Actually, that special power of Ketoret can be brought directly to face off against, like, the Malach HaMavet as it sort of instantiates God's anger. One more, right? Vayamod bein hametim uvein hachayim, right? Now this is Aharon. He stands between the living and the dead, which is also kind of interesting because it seems the image is almost like the Magefa is just like sweeping methodically. It's like, you know, one of these like green death things in like a cartoon, right? It's sort of like everybody on one side of a line has it and everyone on the other side doesn't yet. So Amad Hamalach, the Aharon mina'o v'lo hanichol avor, right? Because, right, it's like almost what's happening is like the Malach HaMavet is just like making his way through with the scythe or whatever his instrument is called, sickle, I don't know. So the angel is there, right? And Aaron stops him from proceeding below Nicho, and he doesn't stop him, but and he sort of like holds on to his belt or whatever. And it says, right, as it says, and the plague was stopped, which it's probably reading about, like, it's probably reading that in some sort of weird grammatical way. And that's why it says about this, it says God blesses his chayil, right? Chayil there probably meaning strength, right? Or like a play on chayil, not as sort of like your valor, like eshet chayil, but your actual strength, like, you know, chayal, right? So God, right, Aharon sort of confronts the angel of death, and God seems to like that, right? This is sort of the next pasuk from Devarim. That's why these two midrashim are companions. Amar malach la'Aharon hamakom shlachani laharog v'tamach hazikbi. The angel's like, hey Aaron, I'm actually like God's messenger. So what do you think you're doing, right? Amar lo Aharon kach tzivani Moshe shechazik b'cha. Listen, like, what can I do? Moshe told me to hold on to you, right, to keep you from proceeding. Amar lo hamalach ani omer lach hakadosh baruch hu shlachani v'ata omer li Moshe. Right? He's like, that's very nice, but that's not responsive. I just told you I'm God's messenger. And you tell me like, oh, but I'm Moshe's messenger? Like, which of those wins, Aaron, right? God wins. Sorry. So, Kol Masha Amar li Moshe Amarlo. So Aaron says back, actually, everything Moshe says also comes from God. So this is a God versus God challenge, not a God versus man challenge. And then he says, who's really going to believe you? And then it says like Aaron basically drags him to the tent of meeting. And that's why it says at the end that Aaron, at the end of our passage that we read, that Vayashav Aaron El Moshe El Petach, right? Why did Aharon he went out to the camp, he stopped the plague. Why did he come back? Because he's coming back with the Malach HaMavet. I don't know if anyone feels like this, but this also feels like a very kind of fairy tale moment, right? Where you have like this big confrontation between, right? Each person maybe had, I don't know, maybe I'm sort of like overreading the Grim Reaper kind of situation, but right, like you have these people, right? Aaron has his like magical implement and he says like, you shall not pass, right? And then the angel of death is like, who are you to tell me I can't pass? And they sort of have this like battle of the wills, as it were, and Aaron wins. And this doesn't quite fit with the idea that Aaron learned this, or that Moshe learned this secret from the angel of death, right? But that's okay. But it seems like Moshe has some secret that he can overpower him in some way. So it's kind of like, right? And I think this image of Aaron basically just straight out defying the angel of death, again, comes from the fact that like they haven't done anything to fix whatever the underlying problem is that caused the plague. Well, they did yesterday, but whatever people are doing now that's caused them to get a plague, nothing has changed, right? They're just saying like, "Lo, let's not do that." I think there's a source at the end that I think really puts that in a nice context. But I don't know. I really like this sort of this like our own angel of death, like mega confrontation. It's like, this is like, the end of the season kind of level of drama. So, okay. So there they have it. And here's our pasuk, right? And it's interestingly similar to our Pinchas moment, right? Like the Aaron's power to do this is connected to him being a Kohen through the citation of these verses about the role of the Levites as sort of the servants of God, right? That it's Moshe knows what to do. Moshe is the one with the secret, but Aaron is the one who actually has to do it. In part because it's Aaron's kahuna, Aaron's priesthood that was challenged, but in part maybe because this is the function of the priest, as we're going to see, right? This whole thing of stopping death and protecting people is much more Aaron's vibe than Moshe's vibe. Okay. So I'm going to take a step back for a second, back to our psukim. So remember, the people, this all started after the whole confrontation with the Levi, with the Korach people, and God sort of, decisively demonstrated that God is on the side of Aharon. And then the next morning, the people are still complaining. So Sforno and the Orach Chaim in more length are going to explain, like, what are they complaining about? And Sforno, I think, Sforno is sort of like a preview of what's going to come up in the next two sources. So I put it here because he's much more concise. So first thing is, right? You have killed the people of God, right? God's nation, meaning like, it's your fault that these 253 plus people are dead, right? Shamartem lahem shinis, right? So what does this mean? You have killed them. Who killed those people? Like, how did they die?
God killed them.
Right. So why do the people come to Moshe and say, oh, you killed them, right? Like, it's pretty clear that if God zaps you, that's not really Moshe. So it could be, right, Moshe maybe prayed, maybe, like, I always sort of read this as like, they're sort of blaming Moshe for standing up for his kavod in a way that like, like causes this confrontation. But this is like a very interesting view that's like, actually, it's more basic than that, right? Shamartem, right? You, Moshe, are the one who suggested this confrontation. Shamartem lam shina suba ketorah. You said, hey, everybody come, let's have this ketorah face-off, right? She'ein ra'uah she'ektirenu el makrivo la b'tamid, right? Which, like, actually, right, the ketoret is only supposed to be brought by the person who brings the daily offering, right? This is talking about that my mother mentioned, right? The daily ketoret, right? Ketoret is a special thing. It's only supposed to be brought by certain people in certain times and places. And you, Moshe, are the one who suggested to people that they should, who are not among those certain people, right, that they should do it. So of course they're going to get killed, right? You should have picked something different. You shouldn't have picked ketoret, right? Ketoret is too sort of like obscure. Now, of course, that's probably why Moshe picked Ketoret, right? Because the point is, you're not Aharon. But in any case, the idea is, right, like, by even suggesting the challenge through which they died, you basically sort of encourage them to, go to their own death. Okay. Right? These actually follow on each other in Sforno. He doesn't say anything in between, right? When Aaron stood between the living and the dead, right? Right? Once he's already there, he sort of made his last stand, right? He also stuck around to protect the sick, right? The people who sort of had been stricken by whatever the Magefa is, but not yet died, right? Aaron is sort of like a healer, right, in some ways. And this is noteworthy because al hefech hibadlu mitocheda, which is the opposite of what God had said in the previous chapter, which was get away from, is about to say also, right, get away from these terrible people, and I'm just going to kill them all, right? So, right, there's something about Aharon where he's sort of like, he uses the Ketoret, but there's also something about his being present with the people that is important to what he's doing here. So that's, both of those things are going to come back in the next two sources, right? Both that there is something about the mechanics of the trial that might seem to an observer to have been sort of excessive, sort of have sprung a trap for these people to walk right into, right? Where maybe you could have done it a different way. And also, right, the idea of Aaron's role. Okay, so first I want to talk about the Orach Chaim. I wrote this in English. It may not be so good, but it is what it is. I'll skim it in English because it's very verbose, right? So, right, the Orach Chaim has a reading of the previous sort of parak where Moshe tries to prevent their deaths by sort of like begging them, like, you guys, you're wrong, and he sort of like tries to convince them that they're wrong without just sort of being like, okay, God, smite them now. But in any case, right, the complaint of the people was about how Moshe made the test of the incense with all of them together, right? So similar to what Sforno's saying, right? Maybe he should have used a different type of offering. Or Chaim is saying, well, he should have just like, right, there's 250 people who are Korach followers, rather than sort of do this Eliyahu and Har Carmel moment of like me versus the 250 guys, right? Just like pick Korach. Korach is a leader. Korach will lose, and then everybody else will go away, and their lives can be spared. Okay. This is what it says, right? You've killed. They were basically saying, Moshe, you set up the situation that sort of doomed them to fail. What's the premise of that? Why did they get killed why did those 250 people, let's say, right? So another interesting thing he's saying is that people are not really upset about, like, they're happy to see Korach go. They get that he was wrong, but they're upset about the seemingly innocent followers of Korach who were killed, right? And the premise seems to be that why did these people get killed? Not because they followed Korach necessarily, right? But because they actually did this thing, like Nadav and Avihu, right? If you touch Ketorah when you're not supposed to, you're going to die, right? So even though in their heart they were the same, right? If you had just set up the trial differently, Moshe, so that they didn't have to touch Ketorah, they could have been spared, right? Or then he has an alternative view. But like, they're both, if you read it yourself, you can, right? They're both basically similar, which is basically, right, there's something about this Ketorah trial which is inherently risky in a way that maybe even some other formulations of the trial wouldn't have been so risky. And Moshe, it's your fault that you set it up that way and that the people died, meaning that we don't assume that everybody with sympathy towards Korach dies, right? It's because of what they did, not because of what they thought. Okay. Okay, this I'll read in Hebrew. Right? So basically, according to the Or HaChaim, the sort of cure, right, this Ketorah cure is designed to respond to this critique. The critique is, Moshe, why did you set all these people up to do an inappropriate Ketorah service, which would automatically lead to their death, right? And the answer is, oh no, like, that's not what led to their death, right? People can do Ketorah in inappropriate times and places, witness Aaron, and live to tell the tale, right? Like, Aaron's going to do a thing that according to you is just automatic. Anybody who does it wrong is going to die, and he's not going to die because God likes him. And that's the point of this, right? Those people died not because I set them up, but because God wanted them to die. Okay. That's thing one. And also, right, he sort of talks, this is where we see the analogy to Eliyahu and Har Carmel, right? Like, it's actually it is somewhat challenging. Like, how is it that, like, maybe it's not automatic, right? His point is that it's totally not automatic that you get zapped just because you bring Ketorah in the wrong place. But like, actually, that's kind of weird. Who says Aaron can just like use the Ketorah as this magical talisman, right? Like, the Ketorah is supposed to be only brought in certain times and places. And he ends up not saying, for example, right, like, oh, well, it's a secret from the Malach HaMaves, right? But that the Ketorah actually here, right, is, right, like, this is what we call a horat shah, right? It's like a temporary suspension of the rules that, like, in order to prove you're right, or in order to, you have to break the law to save it, basically, right? So we're going to put we're going to do the Ketorah in the wrong way for the defense of the honor of Aharon and the Ketorah in more broadly. The Ketorah is not a thing that just kills people. It's God who's behind it all. Okay. This is what I really want to, I really like this reverse. And I think, right, there's seeds of it, right? So remember, right, Sforno just kind of noticed two things. Sforno noticed, right, one, right, that maybe like the complaint about you killed God's people might be a complaint about the nature of the trial as it was set up, not about sort of why did you pick a fight with Korach, right? Korach picked a fight with you, but why did you set it up so that these 250 people had to die, right? Number one. And number two, that Aharon is sort of sticking with the people at a time when maybe God would have told them otherwise to stay away from them. Okay, so, right, and the Or HaChaim's answer to the first thing is, oh, actually, right, the Ketorah cure is designed specifically to highlight that it's not the Ketorah itself that kills, but that it's God. But here's it. Rav Hirsch has a different view on how the Ketorah cure is designed to sort of like fix or respond, let's say, to the underlying problem. right? I'll read it in English because this is my English because I was running on a time crunch. I think there is a cut and paste available in English, but I don't think this was written in Hebrew, so whatever. The claim of the people was surely entirely an ascription of personal guilt, meaning they were saying to Moshe, it wasn't like, we don't want a leader. It was like, Moshe, you're a bad leader, we should be the leader, right? It wasn't like we want a different form of government. It was just like, we want to be the leaders, not you, right? It was all sort of like this it was very personal. I think that you see that in some ways by Moshe's emotional reaction to what's happening, that he doesn't have a good argument about like why, other than like, you just have to trust me that I'm right? Or similar, right? He says like, I never I never took anything from them. It's it's about his leadership as a person, and maybe Aharon also. Okay, if that's what you want, right? So God said to Moshe, if you want, remove yourself from them and I'll destroy the masses who rise against you. Meaning God's saying, like, listen, Moshe, I'm on your side, right? In some ways, this is what the people say in the previous thing, right? I'm on your side, whatever you want, like I'll just zap all the bad guys, right? And then you'll have your kingdom again, right? But Moshe and Aaron didn't do that. Rather, they fell on their faces. This is already in chapter 16, right? God says, right, like, I'm so angry with these people, just like get out of their midst and I'll zap them. And Moshe and Aaron are like, no, actually, that's not what we want, right? So they stay there. They basically use themselves as human shields for the people, which is a precursor to what's going to happen later, where Aaron becomes the shield for the people who are dying in the plague. They didn't act according to the intention that the upstairs masses ascribed to them. So here he says, right again, right, this cure itself sort of undercuts the accusation, right? In the Orach Chaim, it undercuts the accusation that sort of you automatically kill people by using Ketoret, but here it undercuts the accusation that Moshe and Aaron are selfish, right? That they're in it for themselves and they're not good leaders because, right, they're willing to to take it from the people in order to save them. Right? They didn't act according to the intention that the upstart masses ascribed to them. They did not seek the death of those who harm them, and they refused to be agents, shluchim, of death among the people of God, right? Meaning, they could have, if they had done what God said, right, like get out of the people, they would all die. And Moshe and Aaron are like, no, actually our job as leaders, as good leaders, is to not do that, to keep them from dying, right? Rather, Aaron ran into the midst. I really like the description. He ran, but he ran into the midst of the people, which is already adjudged to death, right? God is already killing them, right? And Aaron they didn't have to leave, but they could have also like not intervened. They could have just been like, God's going to do God's thing, right? These are two slightly separate parts of the narrative, but okay, right? So he ran into the middle of people who were already adjudged to death, and he gave expression to giving himself over to God in heart and soul, right? It's not necessarily a simple thing, right? There's a plague. In these other midrashim, there's the guy in the black with the sickle, like walking around in the camp, and Aaron like runs up to confront him, right? He's taking a personal risk to some degree, right? And the expression of his incense, which is the instrument of getting close to God, is the expression of his devotion, right? But it's devotion not just to God, but to the people, it seems like, right? So he stood between the dead and the living, like an agent of atonement and salvation. This way, Aaron showed the people his true character and the true nature of his appointment to redeem and to defeat death. Okay, right? So I thought this was very interesting, right? Because basically, right, the Ketoret cure parallels the accusation, but the accusation is you don't care about us. And Aaron's like, no, I care about you so much that I'm going to use the instrument for my profession in an inappropriate way in order to save your life, right? That like, even though you hate me, I can't let you go, right? I'm going to sort of go and be there with you in your suffering, right? And try and pull you out again. And in general, right, this is the idea of defeating death as the purpose of kapara. I was reading, I read the secondhand, but I'll believe it, that Jacob Milgram writes that's sort of how expiation works in the ancient Near East, right? That like you sort of, or in the Bible, which is not true in all of the ancient Near East, right? That like the sacrifice represents the sort of like, the death of the sacrifice is like the impurity or the guilt that you're trying to expiate. And the Kohanim eating it is showing that they triumph over it, right? That life triumphs over it. But right, as opposed to in other cultures where the thing itself becomes so impure that nobody can consume it, the idea of consuming it shows that the Kohanim are sort of, they're the agents of triumphing over impurity, but actually like it's not a mechanistic process. It happens through God's actions in the Mishkan, and then the Kohanim can sort of symbolically eat it. That might have been a little bit garbled, but right, there's something here about, right, kapara, right, like in some ways the role of the Mishkan and the role of Aharon always is to help people defeat death. And here, this is just sort of like the most extreme instantiation of it. But for my sort of pulling it back, and I see the time, so I'm just going to say a sentence or two, right? Pulling it back, thinking about Rabbi Akiva, right? I said in the first day, right, when the Rabbi Akiva story, it's not clear what stops the plague, but it's pretty clear what starts it is sort of like mistreatment of each other and discord and, disrespect maybe. In this case, it seems like what stops it is the opposite, right? Aharon is the person we call Ohev Shalom V'Rodef Shalom, right? He's always sort of seeking peace, even at the expense of truth, right? In a variety of sources. So, right, that what starts the plague is the same, right? Discord and hatred and lashon hara, and what stops it is going to be Aharon's willingness to sort of like the leader's willingness to sacrifice himself and to be with the people even at a risk to himself, and that's in some ways what it means to sort of like confront the angel of death, right? That like, if you're going to sit back and let the people die, or you're going to run away scared, you're never going to be able to really sort of stop these negative things from happening, right? These plagues. But the willingness to confront it is what allows him to actually succeed in confronting it, I guess I would say. So thank you so much for joining these 3 sessions. I think that the Piyut stuff, I happen to love Piyut, so if you do too, I encourage you to go to the other sessions this week. And thank you so much, Noah, as well, for facilitating.
So thank you, Ms. Gedwiser, as always, for a wonderful class, and to everyone who joined us here on Zoom, on Facebook Live, and on Drisha Live. We really appreciate having you as part of our learning community. I would also like to plug those classes we have coming up tomorrow night, Wednesday night, and Thursday night again. You can learn about them and register on our website, drisha.org/classes. And I do believe that we still have some spaces in our longer term summer programs. So there is going to be the annual, I want to characterize it as Torah summer camp for teenage girls. And if I were a high school aged girl, I would definitely want to be doing that. If I were a caregiver of a high school aged girl, I would definitely want to be sending her away for something so nice. And we also have Kollel, which will be meeting online. So if you know someone who might be free for 3 or 6 weeks, I would love to have more classmates. And I hope that everyone stays well, and we see you again very, very soon with more Drisha programs.